Chapter 8 Attaining the Supreme. Text 1 Arjuna Vacha Kim Tad Brahma Kim Adhyatmam Kim Karma Purushottama Adibhutam Cha Kim Proktam Adidevam Kim Uchyate. Arjuna Vacha. Arjuna said, Kim what? That Brahman. Kim what? Adhyatmam, the self. Kim what? Karma, fruitive activities. Purushottama, O Supreme Person. Adibhutam, the material manifestation. Cha, and Kim what? Proktam is called. Adidevam, the demigods. Kim what? Uchyate is called. Translation. Arjuna inquired, O my Lord, O Supreme Person, what is Brahman? What is the self? What are the fruitive activities? What is the material manifestation? And what are the demigods? Please explain this to me. In this chapter, Lord Krishna answers different questions from Arjuna. What is Brahman? The Lord also explains karma, fruitive activities, devotion service, and yoga principles, and devotion service in its pure form. The Srimad Bhagavatam explains that the supreme absolute truth is known as Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. In addition, the living entity, the individual soul, is also called Brahman. Arjuna also inquires about Atma, which refers to body, soul, and mind. According to the Vedic dictionary, Atma refers to the mind, soul, body, and senses also. Arjuna has addressed the Supreme Lord as Purushottama, the Supreme Person, which means that he was putting his question not simply to a friend but to the Supreme Person, knowing him to be the Supreme Authority, able to give definite answers. Text 2 Adiyagya katam kotra dehesmin madhusudana prayanakali shakatam neyo sinyatatmami. Adiyagna, Lord of the sacrifice, katam, how, kaha, who, atra, here, dehe, in the body, asmin, this, madhusudana, O Madhusudana, prayana, call at the time of death, cha, and katam, how, near, asi, can be known, niyata, atmabi, by the self-control. Translation. Who is the Lord of sacrifice and how does he live in the body? O Madhusudana, and how can those engaged in devotion which know you at the time of death? Lord of sacrifice may refer to either Indra or Vishnu. Vishnu is the chief of the primal demigods, including Brahma and Shiva, and Indra is the chief of the administrative demigods. Both Indra and Vishnu are worshipped by Yajna performances, but here Arjuna asks who is actually the Lord of Yajna, sacrifice, and how the Lord is residing within the body of the living entity. Arjuna addresses the Lord as Madhusudana because Krishna once killed a demon named Madhu. Actually, these demons, which are of the nature of doubt, should not have arisen in the mind of Arjuna, because Arjuna is a Krishna conscious devotee. Therefore, these doubts are like demons. Since Krishna is so expert in killing demons, Arjuna here addresses him as Madhusudana so that Krishna might kill the demonic doubts that arise in Arjuna's mind. Now, the word Prayanakali in this verse is very significant because whatever we do in life will be tested at the time of death. Arjuna is very anxious to know of those who are constantly engaged in Krishna consciousness. What should be their position at that final moment? At the time of death, all the bodily functions are disrupted. The mind is not in a proper condition. Thus, disturbed by the bodily situation, one may not be able to remember the Supreme Lord. Maharaj Kuleshekar, a great devotee, prays, My dear Lord, just now I am quite healthy, and it is better that I die immediately so that the swan of my mind can seek entrance at the stem of your lotus feet. The metaphor is used because the swan, a bird of the water, takes pleasure in digging into the lotus flowers. Its sporting proclivity is to enter the lotus flower. Maharaj Kuleshekar says to the Lord, Now my mind is undisturbed and I am quite healthy. If I die immediately thinking of your lotus feet, then I am sure that my performance of your devotion service will become perfect. But if I have to wait for my natural death, then I do not know what will happen, because at that time the bodily functions will be disrupted. My throat will be choked up and I do not know whether I shall be able to chant your name. Better let me die immediately. Arjuna questions how a person can fix his mind on Krishna's lotus feet at such a time. Text 3 Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Aksharam Brahma Paramam Swabhavo Adhyatma Uchyate Bhuta Bhavodvara Karo Visarga Karma Samnita. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, said, Aksharam, indestructible, Brahman, Paramam, transcendental, Swabhava, eternal nature. Adhyatma, the self, Uchyate, is called Bhuta Bhava, Udbhava, Kara, producing the material bodies of the living entities. Visarga, creation, Karma, fruitive activities. Samnita is called. Translation: The Supreme Personality of Godhead said the indestructible, transcendental living entity is called Brahman, and his eternal nature is called Adhyatma. The self, action pertaining to the development of the material bodies of the living entities is called Karma or fruitive activities. Purport: Brahman is indestructible and eternally existing in it, and its constitution is not changed at any time. But beyond Brahman there is Parabrahman. Brahman refers to the living entity and Parabrahman refers to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The constitutional position of the living entity is different from the position we take, from the position he takes in the material world. In material consciousness, his nature is to try to be the Lord of matter, but in spiritual consciousness, Krishna consciousness, his position is to serve the Supreme. When the living entity is in material consciousness, he has to take on various bodies in the material world. That is called karma, or varied creation by the force of material consciousness. In the Vedic literature, the living entity is called Jivatma and Brahman, but he is never called Parabrahman. The living entity Jivatma takes different positions. Sometimes he merges into the dark material nature and identifies himself with matter, and sometimes he identifies himself with superior spiritual nature. Therefore, he is called the Supreme Lord's marginal energy. According to his identification with material or spiritual nature, he receives a material or spiritual body. In material nature, he may take a body from any of the 84 lakh species of life, but in spiritual nature, he has only one body. In material nature, he is manifested sometimes as a man, demigod, animal, beast, bird, etc. according to his karma. To attain material heavenly planets and enjoy their facilities, he sometimes performs sacrifice as yajna. But when his merit is exhausted, he returns to earth again in the form of a man. This process is called karma. The Chandogya Upanishad describes the Vedic sacrificial process. On the sacrificial altar, 5 kinds of offerings are made into 5 kinds of fire. The 5 kinds of fire are conceived as the heavenly planets, clouds, the earth, the man and woman. And the 5 kinds of sacrificial offerings are faith, the enjoyer on the own mirror, the rain, grains and semen. In the process of sacrifice, the living entity makes specific sacrifices to attain specific heavenly planets and consequently reaches them. When the merit of sacrifice is exhausted, the living entity descends to earth in the form of rain and then takes in the form of the grains, and the grains are eaten by a man and transformed into semen, which impregnates a woman. And thus the living entity once again attains the human form to perform the sacrifice and so repeat the same cycle. In this way, the living entity perpetually comes and goes on the material path. The Krishna conscious person, however, avoids such sacrifices. He takes directly to Krishna consciousness and thereby prepares himself to return to Godhead. Impersonalist commentators of the Bhagavad Gita unreasonably assume that Brahman takes the form of a jiva in the material world, and to substantiate this they refer to the chapter 15, verse 7 of the Gita. But in this verse, the Lord also speaks of the living entity as an eternal fragment of myself. The fragment of God, the living entity, may fall down into the material world, but the Supreme Lord Achyuta never falls down. Therefore, this assumption that the Supreme Brahman assumes the form of Jiva is not acceptable. It is important to remember that in Vedic literature, Brahman, the living entity, is distinguished from Parabrahman, the Supreme Lord. Text 4. Adibhutam ksharo bhavo purushascha adidaivatam adiyagnoam evatra dehe dehabritambara. Adibhutam, the physical manifestation, kshara, constantly changing, bhava, nature, purusha, the universal form, including all of the demigods like the sun and the moon, cha and Adidevam, called Adideva, Adiyagya, the super soul, Aham, I, Krishna, Eva, certainly, Atra, in this Dehe body, Deha Britam, of the embodied, Para, best, O best. Translation: O best of the embodied beings, the physical nature which is constantly changing is called Adibhuta, the material manifestation. The universal form of the Lord, which includes all the demigods like the source of the sun and moon, is called Adideva. And I, the Supreme Lord, represented as the super soul in the heart of every embodied being, am called Adiyagya, the Lord of sacrifice. Purport: the physical nature is constantly changing. Material bodies generally passes through 6 stages. They are born, they grow, they remain for some duration, they produce some byproducts, and they dwindle, and then they vanish. This physical nature is called Adibhuta. It is created at a certain point and will be annihilated at a certain point. The conception of the universal form of the Supreme Lord, which includes all the demigods and their different planets, is called Adidevata. And the present in the body along with the individual soul is the super soul, a plenary portion of Lord Krishna. The super soul is called Paramatma or Adhyagya and is situated in the heart. The word eva is particularly important in this context of this verse, because by this word the Lord stresses that Paramatma is not different from him. The super soul, the supreme person, God is seated beside the individual soul, is a witness of the individual soul's activities and is the source of the soul's various types of consciousness. The super soul gives the individual soul an opportunity to act freely and witnesses his activities. The functions of all these different manifestations of the Supreme Lord automatically become clarified for the pure Krishna conscious devotee engaged in transcendental service to the Lord. The gigantic universal form of the Lord called Adidevata is contemplated by the neophyte who cannot approach the Supreme Lord in his manifestation as super soul. The neophyte is advised to contemplate the universal form or Virat Purusha, whose legs are considered the lower planets, whose eyes are considered the sun and moon, and whose head is considered the upper planetary systems. Text 5. Antakale cha mameva smaran mukva kalevaram ya prayati samadbhavam yati nasti atra samshaya. Antakale, at the end of life, cha, also me, eva, certainly, smaran, remembering, mukva, quitting, kalevaram, the body, yaha, he who, prayati, goes, saha, he, madbhava, my nature, yati, achieves, na, not, asti, there is, atra, here, samshaya, doubt. Translation. And whoever at the end of his life quits his body, remembering me alone, at once attains my nature. Of this there is no doubt. Purport. In this verse, the importance of Krishna consciousness is stressed. Anyone who quits his body in Krishna consciousness is at once transferred to the transcendental nature of the Supreme Lord. The Supreme Lord is of the purest of the pure. Therefore, anyone who is constantly Krishna conscious is also the purest of the pure. The word smaran, remembering, is important. Remembrance of Krishna is not possible for the impure soul who has not practiced Krishna consciousness in devotional service. Therefore, one should practice Krishna consciousness from the very beginning of life. If one wants to achieve success at the end of his life, the process of remembering Krishna is essential. Therefore, one should constantly, incessantly chant the Maha Mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Lord Chaitanya has advised that one be as tolerant as a tree, Tarorapi Krishna. There may be so many impediments for a person who is chanting Hare Krishna. Nonetheless, tolerating all these impediments, one should continue to chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, so that at the end of one's life one can have the full benefit of Krishna consciousness.